Together we'll explore biblical truths, a beacon of hope and transformative wisdom. So like and share to spread the light. Subscribe, walk this sacred path with us. Comment, share your spiritual insights, show gratitude, connect through love. Check out products below, support our mission. Your purchase fuels our ministry's calling. Each video, a revelation, each story, a blessing. The devastating price of sin. 7 reasons God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Throughout human history, we've witnessed nature's awesome power to destroy entire cities in mere moments. In 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted, burying Pompeii under volcanic ash, preserving its final moments like a haunting photograph of destruction. In 2011, Japan experienced the merciless force of a tsunami that swept away entire communities in minutes. In 2023, Turkey faced devastating earthquakes that turned cities into rubble. And in Vermont, unprecedented floods transformed peaceful towns into raging rivers. Yet, among all these natural disasters, there stands a unique story of destruction, one caused not by nature's fury, but by divine judgment. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah represents something far more profound than mere physical destruction. It serves as an eternal warning about the consequences of moral decay and spiritual corruption. In the annals of biblical history, these twin cities hold a special place of infamy. After Jerusalem, God's chosen city, and Bethlehem, where Christ was born, perhaps no other biblical locations have captured human imagination quite like Sodom and Gomorrah. But why? What made these cities so noteworthy that their names have become synonymous with divine punishment? Today, we'll uncover 7 deadly sins that led to their destruction, sins that, surprisingly, mirror many of our modern society's struggles. This isn't just an ancient tale of punishment. It's a mirror reflecting our own world's moral challenges. From the prideful posts on social media to the growing isolation in our digital age, we'll see how these ancient sins wear modern masks. What's particularly fascinating is how these sins interconnect, creating a web of moral decay that feels eerily familiar in our contemporary world. As we examine each sin, you might recognize patterns in our own society, patterns that should give us pause and prompt us to reflect on our own paths. The destruction of these cities wasn't just about punishing sin, it was about showing future generations the ultimate price of moral corruption. As we dive deeper into each sin, we'll explore not only their historical context, but also their modern manifestations and the psychological pressures that lead people to commit them. Number 1, wickedness, the root of all evil. In the shadow of Sodom's walls, wickedness wasn't just an occasional occurrence. It was the city's heartbeat. Like a disease that infects every cell of the body, wickedness had penetrated every aspect of daily life. The Bible tells us, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous. Genesis 18:20. Consider this profound truth. Wickedness begins not with grand acts of evil, but with small compromises. In Sodom, as in our modern world, it started with the subtle erosion of moral boundaries. The city didn't plunge into darkness overnight. It descended gradually, one small choice at a time, until the light of righteousness became nothing but a distant memory. What made this wickedness particularly grievous was its comprehensive nature. Imagine a society where cruelty wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. Where violence wasn't just an incident, it was entertainment. Where deception wasn't just a survival tool, it was a way of life. The streets that should have echoed with laughter and commerce instead rang with the cries of the oppressed and the boasts of oppressors. In our modern world, we see echoes of this ancient wickedness wearing new masks. When corruption becomes institutionalized in corporate boardrooms, when cyberbullying destroys young lives, when human trafficking operates behind legitimate businesses, aren't we witnessing the same darkness that once filled Sodom's streets? The tools may have changed, but the heart of wickedness remains the same. The psychological roots of this wickedness often stem from what social scientists call moral disengagement. In Sodom, as in our modern world, people didn't suddenly become wicked. It was a gradual process, like a slowly tightening noose. First comes the justification. Everyone does it. Then the minimization. It's not that bad. Finally, the celebration. This is who we are. The social pressure to conform to wickedness is perhaps stronger today than ever before. In Sodom, evil was confined within city walls. Today, it travels at the speed of light through fiber optic cables. Social media has become our modern city square, where virtue and vice compete for attention, and too often, vice wins. The same peer pressure that turned Sodom's citizens toward evil now operates through likes, shares, and viral trends. Consider the story of a young professional I recently counseled. She described how her workplace slowly normalized dishonest practices. It started with small things, she said. Fudging numbers here, hiding information there. Before I knew it, I was part of a system that destroyed people's lives through financial fraud. Her story mirrors the pattern of Sodom, the gradual acceptance of evil until it becomes normal. Today's digital age has given wickedness new platforms to flourish. Behind anonymous screens, people unleash cruelty that would make even the citizens of Sodom pause. The distance between action and consequence has grown wider, making it easier to ignore the human cost of our choices. We've created a world where virtual sins feel less real, yet their impact on human souls remains just as devastating. Abraham's plea for Sodom becomes particularly poignant when viewed through this lens. His negotiation with God wasn't just about numbers. It was about the nature of righteousness itself. Could even a small group of righteous people influence a corrupt society? The tragic answer was that Sodom's wickedness had become so pervasive, not even 10 righteous souls could be found. This brings us to a critical question. How do we measure wickedness in our own time? Perhaps it's not just in obvious acts of evil, but in the small compromises we make daily, the white lies we tell, the injustices we ignore, the darkness we tolerate in the name of peace or profit. What makes wickedness particularly insidious is its ability to disguise itself as normal, even necessary. In Sodom, as in our modern corporations and communities, evil often wears the mask of pragmatism. It's just business, we say. It's just politics. It's just the way things are. These are the same rationalizations that turned Sodom from a city into a synonym for sin. Number 2, idolatry and idol worship, the modern gold. In ancient Sodom and Gomorrah, idolatry wasn't merely about bowing before golden statues. It represented humanity's eternal struggle with misplaced worship. As Romans 1:25 tells us, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator. Today, our idols don't stand in temples of stone. They gleam from smartphone screens, parade down fashion runways, and hover in offshore bank accounts. The ancient practice of idol worship has evolved, becoming more sophisticated but no less dangerous. We've replaced golden calves with golden lifestyles, material success, and digital validation. Consider the modern obsession with social media influence. People spend countless hours crafting perfect online personas, measuring their worth in likes and followers. Isn't this reminiscent of the ancient practice of seeking validation from lifeless idols? The psychological toll is just as devastating. Anxiety, depression, and a constant sense of inadequacy plague our digital generation. The social pressure to conform to these modern idols is overwhelming. Young professionals sacrifice their health, relationships, and moral principles at the altar of career success. Families crumble under the weight of materialism, choosing possessions over presence. The inhabitants of Sodom faced similar pressures, the collective pull toward false worship that promised fulfillment but delivered emptiness. What makes modern idolatry particularly insidious is its subtlety. Unlike the obvious physical idols of Sodom, our contemporary false gods disguise themselves as legitimate pursuits. Career advancement, financial security, social status, these aren't inherently evil. Yet when they become the central focus of our lives, demanding our ultimate allegiance, they transform into idols just as dangerous as those that filled Sodom's temples. The psychological roots of idolatry run deep. Humans naturally seek meaning, purpose, and security. In Sodom, as in our modern world, people turn to false gods out of fear, uncertainty, and the desire for control. Today's idol worshippers might not kneel before statues, but they frantically check their investment portfolios, obsess over their social media metrics, or pursue fame with religious devotion. Consider the story of Silicon Valley's rise and its parallels to ancient idol worship. Technology companies became our modern temples, their founders elevated to almost divine status. People camp outside stores to buy the latest devices, treating product launches like religious ceremonies. The irony? Like the idols of old, these modern gods demand constant sacrifice, our time, attention, and often our very humanity. The social pressure to participate in modern idolatry comes with a heavy price. Just as the citizens of Sodom faced ostracism for refusing to worship false gods, today's individuals risk social exclusion for choosing not to participate in our culture's materialistic worship. The fear of missing out, FOMO, has become a powerful force driving people toward these contemporary idols. What's particularly troubling is how modern idolatry has infiltrated even our pursuit of spirituality. The prosperity gospel movement, for instance, often transforms faith into a transaction, turning God into a cosmic vending machine for material blessings. Isn't this reminiscent of how the people of Sodom approached their deities, seeking favors rather than genuine relationship? The cycle of idolatry follows a predictable pattern. It begins with dissatisfaction, a feeling that something's missing. Then comes the promise, this new thing, this achievement, this status will fill the void. Finally, disillusionment sets in, but rather than abandoning false gods, we often seek newer, shinier ones. Today's social media landscape has amplified this cycle. We're constantly bombarded with images of perfect lives, leading to what psychologists call comparison anxiety. Like the citizens of Sodom comparing the size and splendor of their idols, we measure ourselves against carefully curated online personas, feeding an endless cycle of inadequacy and false worship. The economic implications of modern idolatry are staggering. The global beauty industry, luxury market, and social media platforms profit from our insecurities and idolatrous tendencies. Just as the idol makers of Sodom grew rich from people's spiritual confusion, today's merchants of false fulfillment build fortunes on humanity's misplaced worship. Homosexuality and sexual violence, beyond simple labels. Let us approach this sensitive topic with both truth and grace, understanding that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah reveals something far more complex than modern debates might suggest. The biblical account shows us that the core issue wasn't merely about sexual orientation. It was about violence, violation, and the complete breakdown of moral boundaries. In Genesis 19, we find a chilling account that goes far beyond matters of personal intimacy. The men of Sodom surrounded Lot's house, demanding to know his guests, angels in disguise. This wasn't about love or relationship. It was about power, domination, and violent assault. The Hebrew word used here, yada, in this context clearly indicates an intent of violent violation. Modern scholarship helps us understand the deeper cultural context. In ancient Near Eastern societies, sexual violence was often used as a weapon of dominance and humiliation. This wasn't about attraction, it was about power. The men of Sodom sought to assert their dominance over strangers through the most violating means possible. Today, we face similar issues of power abuse and sexual violence, though often in different forms. From human trafficking to digital exploitation, from workplace harassment to domestic abuse, the core sin of using sexuality as a weapon remains prevalent. The tools may have changed, but the underlying darkness persists. What's particularly relevant for our modern context is understanding how society's moral fabric unravels when we lose sight of human dignity. In Sodom, as in many cases today, sexual sin became intertwined with violence and exploitation. The city's inhabitants had moved far beyond natural desires into what Scripture calls brutal lusts. The psychological aspects of this sin deserve careful consideration. Modern research shows how power dynamics and social pressure can lead to the normalization of abusive behavior. In Sodom's case, the entire community participated in or tacitly approved of sexual violence, a chilling parallel to how modern societies sometimes normalize or ignore abuse. Let's consider the broader implications. The sin of Sodom wasn't just about individual acts. It represented a societal failure to protect the vulnerable. When Lot offered his daughters to the mob, an action we must recognize as deeply wrong, it revealed how thoroughly corrupted the city's moral compass had become. Even those trying to do right had lost sight of true righteousness. In our current digital age, we face new manifestations of these ancient sins. Online exploitation, revenge porn, and cyber harassment show how technology can amplify humanity's capacity for sexual violence. The anonymity of the internet often reveals the same dark impulses that plagued Sodom's streets. The social pressure aspect is particularly relevant today. Just as Sodom's inhabitants likely felt pressure to participate in or ignore evil, modern society often pressures people to accept or overlook sexual exploitation. The fear of being labeled intolerant can lead to silent complicity with genuine abuse. But here's what's crucial to understand. God's judgment on Sodom wasn't simply about sexual sin. It was about the complete corruption of love into violence, the perversion of intimacy into exploitation, and the transformation of human desire into weapons of abuse. This is why attempts to simplify the story into a single-issue narrative miss its broader spiritual and moral implications. What lessons can we draw for our time? First, that sexual sin becomes particularly grievous when it involves exploitation and violence. Second, that societal acceptance of such behavior marks a serious moral decline. And third, that true righteousness involves protecting the vulnerable and maintaining proper boundaries of human dignity. This sin continues to evolve in our modern context. Social media and digital technology have created new avenues for exploitation. The commodification of human sexuality through various industries often leads to the same kind of dehumanization that characterized Sodom. The challenge for our generation is to recognize these patterns and stand against them. For idleness, the silent destroyer of souls. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. Ezekiel 16:49. In the affluent streets of Sodom, idleness wasn't merely about physical inactivity. It was a spiritual malady that corrupted the very soul of society. The city's prosperity had become its spiritual prison, creating a population so comfortable they'd forgotten their divine purpose. Consider this profound truth. Sodom's material abundance led not to gratitude and generosity, but to a deadening of the spirit. Their wealth had removed the need for daily struggle, replacing purposeful living with purposeless existence. They had everything they needed, yet they'd lost everything that mattered. In our modern world, this ancient sin wears new garments. We see it in the endless scroll of social media feeds, in binge-watching cultures that consume but never create, in lives so busy with trivial pursuits they've lost sight of meaningful purpose. The prosperous ease that marked Sodom's downfall has found its modern equivalent in our digital distractions and pursuit of comfort above calling. The psychological impact of idleness reveals itself in what modern researchers call existential boredom. Like Sodom's inhabitants, many today find themselves in a paradox of plenty, surrounded by entertainment and opportunities, yet feeling deeply unfulfilled. The human spirit, designed for purpose and meaning, withers in the absence of genuine challenge and meaningful contribution. Our current hustle culture might seem to contradict this idleness, but often it's merely a mask for the same spiritual vacancy. Being busy isn't the opposite of being idle. True purpose is. Many today fill their lives with activity, but remain spiritually and morally idle, avoiding the real work of soul development and community contribution. The FOMO, fear of missing out, culture has become our modern version of Sodom's prosperous ease. We're constantly connected yet fundamentally disconnected, always consuming but never truly engaging. Social media platforms have become our city squares, where we gather not to contribute or connect, but to distract ourselves from the emptiness within. Consider the tragic irony. Sodom had the resources to transform the ancient world for good, yet chose comfort over calling. Similarly, our generation possesses unprecedented capabilities for positive change, yet often remains paralyzed in comfortable inaction. We have more ways to help others than ever before, yet many remain trapped in self-focused bubbles of entertainment and ease. The social pressure to embrace this idle lifestyle is immense. Just as Sodom's culture normalized purposeless living, our society often celebrates a life of consumption over contribution. We've created a world where living your best life often means maximizing personal pleasure while minimizing meaningful engagement with the world's real needs. What makes this sin particularly dangerous is its subtle nature. Unlike other sins that announce themselves with obvious harm, idleness quietly erodes our capacity for meaningful living. It doesn't just make us inactive, it makes us incapable of recognizing the value of purposeful action. Modern technology has amplified this ancient sin in unprecedented ways. Our devices offer endless opportunities for distraction, creating what psychologists call digital escapism. Like Sodom's inhabitants who turned away from their divine purpose, many today lose themselves in virtual worlds, while the real world cries out for engagement and action. The spiritual cost of this idleness is devastating. When we lose our sense of purpose, we lose our connection to the divine design for our lives. Sodom's sin wasn't just that they had abundance, it was that they failed to use their abundance for good. Their idleness was an active rejection of their God-given responsibility to be a blessing to others. Pride in sin, the modern age of shameless evil. They declare their sin as Sodom. They hide it not. Woe unto their soul, for they have rewarded evil unto themselves. Isaiah 3:9. In Sodom's final days, sin wasn't merely practiced, it was proclaimed. The city had crossed a threshold beyond mere wrongdoing into something far more sinister, the celebration of evil. This wasn't just moral failure, it was moral rebellion, a deliberate flaunting of wickedness that challenged the very foundations of divine order. Today, we witness this ancient sin amplified through digital megaphones. Social media platforms have become modern stages where people not only commit sins, but proudly broadcast them. Like Sodom's inhabitants who boasted of their transgressions, many now compete for attention through increasingly shocking displays of moral degradation. Consider how this manifests in our digital age. Stories of infidelity shared as entertainment. Acts of cruelty filmed for likes and shares. Dishonesty and manipulation celebrated as life hacks. The parallels to Sodom are striking. What was once hidden in shame is now displayed with pride. The psychological dynamics behind this behavior reveal a deeper spiritual crisis. When shame disappears, it doesn't indicate progress, it signals moral decay. In Sodom, as in our modern world, the loss of shame didn't create freedom, it created spiritual bondage. People became enslaved to their own degradation, mistaking moral numbness for moral evolution. Modern social media has created what psychologists call validation feedback loops. People share transgressive behavior, receive positive reinforcement through likes and comments, and are encouraged to push further boundaries. This digital ecosystem mirrors Sodom's culture, where sin became a source of social status. What makes this particularly dangerous is its viral nature. In Sodom, sin's influence was limited by physical boundaries. Today, the celebration of sin crosses continents at the speed of light. A single post glorifying destructive behavior can influence millions, creating what sociologists call moral contagion. The corporate world often amplifies this trend, monetizing moral degradation through what's called shock value marketing. Like the merchants of Sodom, who profited from the city's corruption, modern platforms and businesses often benefit from the viral spread of shameless behavior. Perhaps most troubling is how this pride in sin has infiltrated religious spaces. We see faith leaders compromising biblical truth for popularity, churches adapting their message to match cultural trends rather than challenging them. Isn't this reminiscent of how Sodom's religious institutions likely failed to stand against the tide of moral decay? The social pressure to participate in the celebration of sin is immense. Those who maintain moral standards are often labeled as judgmental or old-fashioned. This mirrors the likely experience of the few righteous souls in Sodom who faced ridicule and hostility for their adherence to divine truth. What's particularly insidious about pride in sin is its progressive nature. It begins with small compromises, laughing at inappropriate jokes, sharing questionable content, quietly approving of what we know is wrong. But like Sodom's descent, each step makes the next easier, until celebration of evil becomes normal. In our educational institutions, this pride in sin often masquerades as moral relativism. The idea that there are no absolute moral truths reflects Sodom's ultimate spiritual confusion, a state where good and evil lose their meaning and personal desire becomes the only standard of right and wrong. 6. Lack of hospitality and compassion, the cold heart of modern society. Your sister Sodom's sins were pride, gluttony, and laziness, while the poor and needy suffered outside her door. Ezekiel 16:49. The story of Sodom reveals a chilling truth about a society's spiritual death. It begins when hearts grow cold toward human suffering. The city's treatment of Lot's heavenly guests wasn't just a momentary lapse. It was the culmination of a cultural pattern where cruelty had replaced compassion and hostility had overcome hospitality. In the ancient Near East, hospitality wasn't just courtesy. It was sacred duty. To turn away a stranger meant more than rudeness. It represented a fundamental rejection of divine law and human dignity. Sodom's violation of this sacred trust revealed a society that had lost its soul while maintaining its wealth. Today we witness this ancient sin wearing modern masks. Our cities boast gleaming towers while homeless people sleep in their shadows. Social media connects us globally while we ignore our neighbors' needs. We've created a world of digital connection and physical isolation, much like Sodom's walls that kept abundance in and compassion out. The psychological impact of this collective coldness manifests in what sociologists call compassion fatigue. Like Sodom's inhabitants, we've learned to walk past suffering, to scroll past need, to build emotional walls that rival Sodom's physical ones. Our capacity for empathy diminishes with each ignored cry for help. Consider how our modern world mirrors Sodom's failure. Gated communities that keep out the needy. Algorithms that shield us from uncomfortable realities. Immigration policies that reject the stranger. Aren't these the modern equivalents of Sodom's closed doors and hostile streets? What's particularly troubling is how we've institutionalized this lack of compassion. Corporate policies prioritize profit over people. Social systems create invisible barriers between the privileged and the needy. Even our churches sometimes become exclusive clubs rather than sanctuaries for the broken. The social pressure to maintain this separation is immense. Like Sodom's citizens who likely justified their cruelty as protecting their way of life, we create sophisticated rationalizations for our lack of compassion. They should help themselves first. It's not my problem. We can't help everyone. Modern technology, rather than bridging these gaps, often widens them. Our devices create what psychologists call empathy barriers, digital walls that make it easier to ignore human suffering. We can block, unfriend, or simply scroll past anything that disturbs our comfort, just as Sodom's walls kept out the cries of the needy. The spiritual cost of this failure is devastating. When we lose our capacity for hospitality and compassion, we lose something essentially human and profoundly divine. Remember, Abraham's greatest moments came through his radical hospitality, contrasting sharply with Sodom's hostile rejection of strangers. Perhaps most dangerous is how this sin disguises itself as wisdom or prudence. We must be careful. We need to protect ourselves. We can't trust strangers. While wisdom has its place, these attitudes often mask the same fear and selfishness that dominated Sodom's culture. Number 7, violence and oppression, the modern face of power abuse. The Lord said, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous." Genesis 18:20. In Sodom's shadow, violence wasn't merely physical, it was systemic, woven into the very fabric of society. The city had institutionalized oppression, creating a system where the powerful could abuse the weak with impunity. Like a cancer spreading through a body, this violence infected every level of society. Today, we witness this ancient sin manifesting in more sophisticated forms. Corporate exploitation, systemic discrimination, digital harassment, the weapons have changed, but the heart of oppression remains the same. Like Sodom's powerful elite, modern oppressors often hide behind legitimate structures and institutions. The story of Lot offering his daughters to the mob reveals how deeply violence had corrupted even good intentions. In our time, don't we see similar compromises? Organizations sacrificing whistleblowers to protect themselves. Communities turning blind eyes to abuse to maintain peace. Leaders choosing institutional stability over justice. Consider the psychological impact of normalized violence. In Sodom, as in our modern world, regular exposure to oppression creates what psychologists call moral desensitization. People become numb to suffering, accepting as normal what should horrify them. Isn't this happening in our digital age, where violence becomes entertainment and oppression becomes policy? The social pressure to participate in systemic violence is often subtle but powerful. In corporate settings, it might mean keeping quiet about unethical practices. In communities, it might mean ignoring discrimination. Like Sodom's inhabitants, we can find ourselves complicit in oppression through our silence. What makes modern oppression particularly insidious is its ability to disguise itself as progress or necessity. It's just business. It's for security. It's for the greater good. These rationalizations echo through history, from Sodom's streets to our modern institutions. The technological amplification of violence deserves special attention. Cyberbullying, online harassment, digital mob justice, these represent new forms of the old violence that plagued Sodom. Our interconnected world has given oppressors new tools to target the vulnerable. Yet perhaps most troubling is how violence becomes entertainment. From viral videos of real-world conflicts to increasingly graphic media content, we've created a culture that commodifies suffering. Like Sodom's inhabitants who turn violence into sport, we risk becoming spectators to our own moral decay. The spiritual cost of this violence extends beyond its immediate victims. When a society normalizes oppression, it loses its capacity for divine connection. The outcry that reached heaven from Sodom wasn't just from its victims, it was from the very earth that bore witness to such perversion of power. Modern examples surround us. Workplace bullying masked as management, economic systems that exploit the vulnerable, social structures that perpetuate inequality. Each represents a continuation of Sodom's fundamental sin, the abuse of power over the powerless. The lesson for our time is clear. When violence becomes acceptable, when oppression becomes normal, when power abuse becomes institutional, judgment isn't far behind. Like Sodom, our societies risk divine reckoning, not just for individual acts of violence, but for creating systems that perpetuate oppression. Conclusion: the echoes of Sodom in our time. As we reflect on these 7 deadly sins of Sodom and Gomorrah, we find ourselves at a critical crossroads. These weren't just ancient failures, they're mirrors reflecting our modern struggles. Let us summarize these eternal warnings. 1. Wickedness became their culture, just as moral corruption often masquerades as progress in our time. 2. Idolatry transformed their worship, similar to how we elevate success, fame, and material wealth above divine truth. 3. Sexual violence revealed their depraved power, paralleling our struggles with exploitation and abuse. 4. Idleness corrupted their purpose, much like our digital distractions and purposeless pursuits. 5. Pride in sin marked their defiance, reflecting our modern celebration of transgression. 6. Lack of compassion sealed their fate, mirroring our growing indifference to human suffering. 7. Violence and oppression defined their society, just as power abuse persists in our institutions. The warning for today. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't just a historical event, it was a divine warning echoing through time. Today, as we witness similar patterns emerging in our societies, we must ask ourselves, are we not walking the same path? Consider how our world embraces these same sins, often with new technologies and sophisticated justifications. Our cities might not face fire from heaven, but don't we see the devastating consequences of moral decay all around us? Broken families, shattered communities, corrupted institutions. These are the modern prices of ancient sins. Yet in this sobering reality, we find hope. Unlike Sodom, we still have time to change course. The story wasn't preserved merely to condemn, it was preserved to warn and guide. Hope for tomorrow. Remember, God's judgment on Sodom came only after every opportunity for repentance was exhausted. Even then, he was willing to spare the city for just 10 righteous people. This reveals a crucial truth. Divine justice is tempered by divine mercy. In our time, we're called not just to avoid these sins, but to actively combat them. We can stand for truth in an age of moral confusion, show genuine compassion in a world of digital isolation, build communities of purpose rather than pleasure, use our influence for righteousness rather than rebellion, protect the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. Dear friends, if this message has touched your heart, don't let it end here. Share this video to spread these crucial truths. Like and subscribe to join our community of believers seeking deeper understanding. If you found value in this teaching, please consider hitting the like button to help others find this message, sharing it with those who need this wisdom, subscribing to join our growing community, supporting our ministry through membership, checking out our recommended resources below, using the thanks button if this has blessed you. Most importantly, let's build a quality community focused on biblical truth. Join as a member to access exclusive content and help us continue spreading God's word. Together, we can be the righteous few who stand against the tide of moral decay. Not through condemnation, but through transformation. Not through judgment, but through love. God bless you all. Until next time, let's live in His truth and grace.